The alarm cut through the mess hall before I even had a chance to sit down with my tray. Red light, 3 short bursts, then silence. Every alien in the room went still. Claws stopped moving. Mandibles stopped clicking. On this station, silence from the Kestari and the Thole meant something had gone wrong, because those 2 species never stopped talking, not even in their sleep. I set my tray down slow and looked at the ceiling vents, waiting for the voice of the station computer to tell us what was happening. Nothing came. Just that ringing quiet, the kind that presses on your ears. "Sit down, small one," said Grelek, a Thole trader twice my height, with skin like wet stone. He did not even look at me when he said it. "Whatever it is not for you to worry about. You cannot lift a wrench, let alone fix a station." A few of the others laughed, not loud, just enough to remind me where I stood in this room. I had heard worse in the 6 months since I signed onto this station as a maintenance tech, the only human among 400 crew from a dozen worlds. I was smaller than nearly every one of them. No claws, no natural armor, no venom, just soft skin and a heartbeat that raced a little faster than theirs when trouble came. My name is Owen Blake, and I was used to being the smallest thing in the room. I picked my tray back up and found a seat near the window, where I could see the black of space and the slow turn of the station ring. I ate in silence while the others speculated about the alarm. A hull stress test gone wrong, a cargo shuttle docking too fast. Nobody seemed worried enough to stop eating, so I told myself it was nothing. That was when the door at the far end of the mess hall opened, and the room went quiet in a different way. He walked in like the floor owed him something. Nearly 9 feet of him, all lean muscle, wrapped in dark gray hide, moving with a kind of quiet control that made every other species in that room shrink half an inch without noticing they had done it. His eyes were pale gold, set deep beneath a heavy brow, and they swept the room once, cataloging everything before he chose a table and sat down alone. I did not know his name yet. I only knew what everyone else on the station already knew. He belonged to a species called the Dravaki, hunters who had never lost a war in recorded memory, a species so feared that entire fleets changed course rather than cross their territory. There was exactly 1 Dravaki on this station, and nobody, not even the Thole, sat near him without being invited. "That is Kaloth," whispered Nira, a Kestari engineer who worked 2 decks below me. She leaned toward me like she was sharing something dangerous. "He came aboard 3 days ago. Nobody knows why. The station commander will not even say what clearance he was given." "Is he here as a guest or a threat?" I asked. Nira's mandibles clicked, which for her species meant something close to a shrug. With the Dravaki, sometimes there is no difference. I watched him for a moment longer than I should have. He ate alone, methodically, without looking at anyone else in the hall, and yet I had the strange feeling that he was aware of every single person in that room, the way a hawk is aware of every mouse in a field, even while looking at none of them in particular. Then, for reasons I could not explain, his head turned. Not toward Grelek, not toward Nira, toward me. Our eyes met across the room for maybe 2 seconds. Then he looked back down at his food, and the moment passed, and I told myself it meant nothing. I was wrong about that too. The alarm turned out to be a false reading from a faulty sensor on the outer hull, the kind of thing that happened once a month on a station this old. By the time my shift started, the whole event had already become a joke among the crew, and Grelak made sure to remind me, twice, that I would have been useless in a real emergency anyway. I did not argue. Arguing had never gotten me anywhere on this station. I had learned that lesson early, back when I first came aboard, and tried to explain that humans were capable of more than our size suggested. Nobody had wanted to hear it then, and 6 months of proving myself with wrenches and diagnostic tools had not changed many minds. Most of the crew still saw me the way you might see a child who had wandered onto a factory floor, useful for small tasks, but not to be trusted with anything that mattered. My real work started in the lower maintenance corridors, 3 levels below the public decks, where the air recyclers and gravity plating lived in a tangle of cables and coolant lines that most of the crew never thought about. I liked it down there. Nobody watched me work. Nobody made comments about my lack of claws while I traced a coolant leak back to a cracked valve seal. Down in the guts of the station, competence was the only thing that mattered, and for once, nobody was there to deny that I had it. I was elbow deep in a coolant housing, 3 hours into my shift, when I heard footsteps behind me that did not belong to any of the maintenance crew I knew. Heavy, deliberate, unhurried. I turned around, and my whole body went cold. Kaloth stood in the corridor entrance, filling nearly the whole frame of the doorway, his pale gold eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my hands stop moving on their own. "You are the human," he said. His voice was low, almost a rumble, but every word came out clear and precise, like he had learned my language carefully rather than simply picked it up. "Owen," I said, because it seemed important to correct him, even though every instinct in my body told me this was not the moment to correct an apex predator on anything. "Owen Blake." He did not respond right away. Instead, he stepped further into the corridor, and I noticed the way he moved his head, slightly lowered, nostrils flaring once, twice, like he was reading the air around me, the way another person might read a page of text. "You smell of machine oil and coolant," he said finally, "and something else." "That would be the protein bar I had for lunch," I said, and immediately wondered why I had made a joke in front of the single most dangerous being on the station. Something flickered across his face, not quite a smile, because Dravaki faces were not built for smiles the way ours were, but something in the set of his jaw loosened, just slightly. "You are not afraid of me," he said. It was not a question. I thought about lying. Then I thought better of it. "I am afraid of you," I admitted. "I am just very good at doing my job while afraid. It comes with the territory of being small, on a station full of people who remind me of it every day." He was quiet for a long moment, studying me the way a scientist studies a sample under a lens, searching for something specific. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back down the corridor, his footsteps fading into the hum of the station's machinery. I stood there for a full minute before I remembered to breathe normally again. I did not tell anyone about the encounter, not because I thought it was a secret, but because I did not know what to make of it myself. When my shift ended, I went back up to the crew quarters and found Daniel Cole waiting for me outside my door, arms crossed, grinning in that easy way of his that had made him the closest thing I had to a friend on this station. Daniel was human too, one of only 3 others aboard, and he worked in cargo logistics 2 decks up. We had bonded early over the shared experience of being underestimated by every alien species we crossed paths with, though Daniel handled it with far more humor than I usually managed. "You look like you saw a ghost," he said. "Worse," I said. "I think the Dravaki was smelling me." Daniel's grin faded into something more serious. "Kaloth? The one everyone is terrified of?" "That's the one." "What did he want?" I thought about how to explain something I did not understand myself. "I don't know. He asked my name. He said I smelled like something, then he just left." Daniel let out a low whistle. "That is either the strangest thing I have heard all week, or the start of something we are going to want to be very careful about." I laughed, mostly to cover the fact that a small part of me agreed with him completely. It's probably nothing. Maybe predators just do that. Size us up, see if we are worth eating. "Comforting thought," Daniel said. "Truly, thank you for that." We walked together toward the mess hall for the evening meal, trading the kind of easy conversation that made the long shifts bearable, and for a while, I managed to push the strange encounter out of my mind. But even as I sat down to eat, I noticed Kaloth again, seated at his usual table across the hall, and this time, when I glanced his way, he was already looking at me. He held my gaze for a long moment. Then he gave the smallest nod, barely a tilt of his massive head, and went back to his meal. Nobody else in the hall seemed to notice. Grelick was busy mocking a Kastari trader about a failed cargo deal. Nira was deep in conversation about sensor calibrations. The room moved on around me, oblivious, while I sat there with the growing feeling that something had shifted, something I did not yet have the words to name. I did not sleep well that night. I lay in my bunk staring at the low ceiling of my quarters, running the encounter over and over in my mind, trying to find some ordinary explanation that would let me stop thinking about it. Predators are curious about new smells. Predators catalog potential threats. Predators are simply strange by nature, and I was reading too much into a single glance across a crowded room. But some part of me, the same part that had learned to trust my instincts back on Earth, long before I ever set foot on a station among the stars, refused to accept any of those explanations. That part of me knew, with a certainty I could not justify, that Kaloth had not looked at me the way a predator looks at prey. He had looked at me the way you look at something you recognize. I did not understand what that meant yet. I only knew that the next morning, when I walked into the mess hall for breakfast, Kaloth was already there, sitting at an empty table, and for the first time since he had come aboard the station, there was an open seat across from him. He was looking directly at me when I noticed it. The whole hall seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what I would do, and I realized, with a strange and sudden clarity, that whatever this was, it was only just beginning. I did not sit down right away. I stood near the food counter with my tray in my hands, feeling the weight of every eye in the room, and for a moment I genuinely considered turning around and eating in the corridor instead. Then I thought about what Daniel would say if he saw me run from an empty chair, and I made myself walk forward. The seat across from Kaloth was closer to him than I had ever been. This near, I could see the fine texture of his hide, like stone that had learned to breathe, and the old pale scars that crossed one side of his jaw, marks that told a story I did not yet know. His eyes tracked me the whole way, unblinking, patient. "You may sit," he said, as if the seat had not already been obviously left open for exactly that purpose. I sat. My tray rattled slightly against the table because my hands were not quite steady, and I hated that he probably noticed. "You did not sleep," he said. "No," I admitted. There did not seem to be much point in lying to something that could apparently smell what I had eaten for lunch the day before. I kept thinking about yesterday, about the corridor. "Good," he said. "You should think about it. Most creatures do not think enough before they act. It is why most creatures do not last very long." I picked at my food, unsure what to say to that. Around us, the hall had returned to its usual noise, though I could feel Nira watching from her table, and Grellick's low laughter had gone quiet in a way that told me he was listening even while he pretended not to. "Can I ask you something?" I said. Kaloth tilted his head slightly, which I had started to understand was his version of an invitation to continue. "Why me?" I asked. "There are 400 people on this station, most of them bigger, stronger, better armed. Why did you come find me in a maintenance corridor?" He was quiet for a long moment, and I thought perhaps I had asked something he did not intend to answer. Then he set down the utensil he had been holding and folded his hands together on the table, a very deliberate, human sort of gesture that looked strange on someone so clearly not human. "On my homeworld," he said, "there is an old test we give to cubs before they are considered old enough to hunt. We do not test strength first. Strength is common. Claws are common. We test something else. We put a cub in a den with something larger and more dangerous than itself, something the cub cannot defeat through force alone, and we watch what the cub does." "What are you supposed to do?" I asked. "Most cubs freeze," he said. "Some cubs run, which is not shameful, only practical. But a rare few do something else. They stay calm. They study the threat. They look for the answer that force cannot give them. Those cubs, we do not call weak. We call them clever, and clever is worth more than strength in my people's eyes, because strength runs out, and cleverness does not." I thought about the coolant valve I had fixed the day before, the quiet satisfaction of solving a problem that had nothing to do with muscle or claws, and something in his story settled uncomfortably close to home. "You watched me work," I said slowly, "in the corridor. That's what you were testing." "I did not need to test you," Kaloth said. I only needed to watch you. You were afraid of me, and you did not let that fear stop your hands from finishing their task. That is rare among the small ones I have met. Most who lack claws also lack the will to work through fear. You have both the lack and the will together, and that combination is not something my people forget easily. I did not know how to respond to that, so I said nothing, and we ate the rest of our meal in a silence that felt, strangely, less uncomfortable than the silence had been at the start. Word of the shared meal spread through the station faster than any official announcement could have managed. By midday, half the crew I passed in the corridors were giving me looks I had never received before, somewhere between confusion and a kind of wary respect they had not thought to extend to a human before. Grelek found me near the cargo bay during my afternoon rounds, and for once, his usual mocking tone had a thread of something else underneath it. "You had breakfast with the Dravaki," he said, not quite a question. "I did," I said, checking a pressure gauge without looking up at him. "Why would he want anything to do with you?" Grelek asked, and though the words could have been another insult, his voice carried genuine confusion rather than contempt this time. "The Dravaki do not share meals with lesser species unless there is a reason. Maybe he just likes my company," I said, mostly to see what Grelak would do with that. He made a sound low in his chest that might have been a laugh under different circumstances. "Nobody likes anyone's company for no reason, small one, not even the Dravaki." He studied me for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted, just slightly, from dismissal to a kind of cautious reassessment. "Be careful. Whatever he wants from you, it is not nothing." I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that it really might be nothing, a passing curiosity from a bored predator with too much time on his hands during an unexplained assignment aboard our station. But even as the thought formed, I did not fully believe it myself. 2 days passed in a strange new rhythm. Kaloth did not seek me out again in the corridors, but he was always present at meals, and the seat across from him remained open, an unspoken invitation that I found myself accepting more often than not. Daniel teased me relentlessly about it, calling me the Dravaki's pet project, though I noticed he always found an excuse to sit nearby whenever I joined that table, close enough to listen, far enough to pretend he was not. It was during the third of these meals that everything changed. I had just sat down when the tension in the mess hall spiked without warning. I felt it before I understood the cause, the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm arrives. Across the hall, near the entrance, a group of Vraxari traders had come in, and one of them, a broad-shouldered creature with mottled green skin and small tusks jutting from his lower jaw, was staring directly at our table with open hostility. "That is Torin," Nero whispered from the next table over, having apparently decided that whatever was happening at Kaloth's table was interesting enough to warrant close observation. "He lost a shipment contract last month, to a Dravaki trading post. He has hated the Dravaki since." Torin crossed the hall in a few long strides, ignoring the way the crowd parted instinctively around him, and stopped at the edge of our table, close enough that I had to tilt my head back to look at him properly. "You?" he said, and it took me a moment to realize he was speaking to me, not to Kaloth. "The little human, I hear you have made yourself a new friend." I set down my utensil carefully. "I'm just eating breakfast." "You are making a mistake," Torin said, his voice low and rough. "Small creatures who attach themselves to big predators tend to get eaten eventually, once they stop being useful or amusing. Perhaps I should save you the trouble and remove the amusement now." The threat hung in the air, and I felt my heart rate climb, that familiar cold spike of fear that came whenever a bigger, angrier alien decided to remind me of my place in the hierarchy of the station. I had faced smaller versions of this moment before: verbal jabs, dismissive comments, the occasional shove in a crowded corridor, and I had always managed to keep my composure by staying quiet and letting it pass. This felt different. Tarun's hand had drifted toward the utility blade clipped to his belt, not drawing it, but resting close enough that the message was unmistakable. I did not have time to decide how to respond because Kaloth moved. He did not stand up. He did not raise his voice. He simply turned his head toward Torin, slow and deliberate, and fixed him with a look that carried more weight than any shout could have managed. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees, though nothing had physically changed except the angle of one predator's gaze. "You will remove your hand from that blade," Kaloth said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the suddenly silent hall, "or you will lose the hand entirely, and I promise you, that will not be a threat I make twice." Torin's hand froze. For a long moment, nobody moved, and I could hear my own pulse in my ears, loud enough that I was certain everyone else could hear it too. "This is not your business, Dravaki," Torin said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "The human is nothing to you, a pet at best." Kaloth rose from his seat then, unfolding to his full height with unhurried menace, and the entire hall seemed to lean away from him without moving an inch. "You are wrong," Kaloth said, "and your mistake is about to cost you more than you understand. This is not a pet. This is not a stranger. Look at him again, Torin, and understand what you are threatening." I sat frozen in my chair, uncertain what was about to happen, uncertain what Kaloth meant, watching as Torin's confidence crumbled under the weight of a predator's stare that had never, in living memory, backed down from anything. "He is my little brother," Kaloth said, and the words landed in that silent hall like a stone dropped into still water, spreading outward in ripples of shock across every face turned toward our table. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. I sat there staring up at Kaloth, my mind struggling to process what he had just said, while around the room, 400 crew members from a dozen different worlds absorbed the same impossible sentence and found themselves, for the first time since I had come aboard this station, completely and utterly speechless. Torin took a slow step backward, his tusks working as though he wanted to say something and found no words adequate to the moment. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, his crew following close behind, none of them looking back. The silence held for several more seconds before the mess hall erupted into a low, buzzing murmur of confusion and disbelief, dozens of conversations starting at once, all of them circling the same impossible question. I looked up at Kaloth, who had already settled back into his seat as though nothing unusual had happened at all, and found him watching me with an expression I was slowly learning to read as something close to satisfaction. "What did you just call me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "You heard correctly," he said. "Why?" I asked. "Because it was the only word my mind could hold on to." Kaloth studied me for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice had dropped lower, meant only for me, though I suspected half the hall was still straining to listen. "There is a story," he said, "older than my grandmother's grandmother, about a bond between our peoples that most Dravaki have forgotten. I have not forgotten it, and 3 days ago, in that maintenance corridor, I found the proof that the story was never just a story at all." I opened my mouth to ask what he meant, but before I could speak, the station's alert klaxon sounded again, 3 sharp bursts that echoed through the hall, and this time, the voice of the station commander followed immediately, tight with an urgency that told everyone in that room this was no faulty sensor. "All crew to stations, unidentified vessels approaching. This is not a drill." Kaloth was already on his feet, and as he turned to look at me, the last traces of warmth from a moment ago hardened into something sharper, something built for exactly this kind of danger. "Stay close to me, little brother," he said. "Whatever is coming, we face it together now." The mess hall emptied in seconds, 400 crew members scattering toward their assigned stations with the practice speed of people who had drilled for this moment more times than they could count. I found myself moving on instinct, following the flow toward the maintenance access near the lower decks, my mind still spinning from what had just happened, when a heavy hand closed gently around my shoulder and steered me in a different direction entirely. Not there, Kaloth said. The bridge deck. You are with me now. I'm a maintenance technician, I said, half jogging to keep pace with his long stride. My station is 3 decks down. Your station has changed, he said, and something in his tone told me this was not a request. We reached the upper observation corridor just as Daniel came sprinting from the opposite direction, cargo logistics badge still clipped crookedly to his uniform. He skidded to a stop when he saw me walking beside Kaloth, his eyebrows shooting up so fast I might have laughed under any other circumstances. You are just full of surprises today, Daniel said, falling into step beside us. First breakfast, now this. Should I be worried you're going to forget the rest of us little people? There's no time for that, I said, though a small, warm part of me was grateful he had run toward the chaos instead of away from it, the way he always did. The observation deck gave a clear view through the reinforced viewport of what was approaching, and my stomach dropped the moment I saw it. 3 vessels, angular and dark, moving in tight formation, unlike any registered trading ship or patrol craft I recognized from 6 months of studying the station's approach logs. They carried no visible markings, no transponder signals that the station's systems could identify, and they were closing distance far faster than any peaceful vessel had reason to. Raiders, Kaloth said, his voice flat and certain. Unmarked, disciplined formation, no attempt to hail. This is not a misunderstanding to be resolved with words. Station Commander Priya Sharma stood at the center of the deck, coordinating a dozen overlapping voices through her comm unit with the calm authority of someone who had faced this exact scenario in simulations more times than she cared to remember. She caught sight of Kaloth and me arriving together, and though her expression flickered with brief confusion, there was no time to question it. Kaloth, she said, your assessment. Boarding craft, he said, studying the approaching vessels with narrowed eyes. Not a bombardment run. They want the station intact. That means cargo, or hostages, or both. We have civilian crew on 6 of the lower decks, Sharma said. If they breach anywhere near the residential ring, we could lose people before defense teams can respond. I felt a cold weight settle in my chest at those words, because the lower residential ring was exactly where most of the station's smaller, more vulnerable crew lived, the support staff and junior technicians who had no combat training and no way to defend themselves against armed raiders. I know those decks, I said, before I had fully decided to speak. The maintenance layout, the access shafts, the emergency bulkheads. I have spent 6 months mapping every inch of that section. Sharma turned to look at me properly for the first time, and I watched her reassess me the same way Torin had, the same way half the crew on this station always did, sizing up my small frame and drawing conclusions before I had finished a single sentence. This is not the time for volunteers who do not understand what they are offering, she said, not unkindly, but firmly. He understands exactly what he is offering, Kaloth said, stepping forward before I could respond. I have watched this one work under pressure. He does not freeze. He does not run, and he knows this station better than anyone standing on this deck, including you, Commander. Sharma studied Kaloth for a long moment, clearly weighing the strange sight of a Dravaki vouching so directly for a human maintenance technician, and something in his certainty seemed to tip the balance. Fine, she said. Blake, you are with the Defense Coordination Team. Cole, you know the cargo bay systems better than anyone on this deck. I want you rerouting emergency power to the bulkhead controls the moment those raiders breach. Daniel gave a sharp nod, some of the color draining from his face, but his jaw set with the same determination I had seen in him during smaller crises over the past months. The next several minutes passed in a blur of preparation. Sharma's team sealed the primary docking corridors, rerouted power away from non-essential systems, and armed the station's limited defense turrets, while Kaloth moved through it all with a calm efficiency that steadied everyone around him, myself included. I found myself falling into old habits, tracing the maintenance schematics in my head, identifying which access shafts could be used to move unseen through the lower decks, which bulkheads could be sealed remotely, which sections had blind spots in the station's aging sensor network. "There," I said, pointing to a display showing the lower residential ring. "If they breach here, at the old cargo airlock, they will have a straight path to the residential quarters, unless someone seals the connecting corridor manually. The automatic systems on that section have been offline for repairs since last month. Then someone will need to seal it manually," Kaloth said, "before the raiders reach it." "I can do it," I said. "I know the manual override sequence. I've used it twice for maintenance drills." Kaloth's gaze settled on me, weighing something I could not quite read in his expression. "That corridor will be directly in the raiders' path," he said. "If they breach before you finish, you will be exposed with no way to retreat." "Then we had better be fast," I said, surprising myself with how steady my voice came out. He held my gaze a moment longer, and I watched something shift behind those pale gold eyes, a decision settling into place. "Then we go together," he said. "I will hold the corridor. You will seal it. Neither of us does this alone." Sharma, listening from a few steps away, gave a short nod of approval, though her expression carried the particular worry of someone sending two people into a dangerous position and knowing there was no better alternative available. We moved fast through the station's access corridors, Kaloth's long strides forcing me into a jog to keep pace, while the tension in the air thickened with every deck we descended. Through the comm channel, I could hear Sharma's voice coordinating the rest of the defense effort, other teams sealing corridors, arming turrets, evacuating civilians toward the station's reinforced core. As we ran, I found myself thinking about the story Kaloth had started to tell me in the mess hall, the one interrupted by the alert klaxon, and I realized I still did not understand what he had meant by an old bond between our two peoples, forgotten by most of his kind, but not by him. "You said there was a story," I said between breaths, as we descended a narrow maintenance ladder toward the lower ring, "about humans and the Dravaki." "There is time enough for the telling later," Kaloth said, though something in his voice told me he wanted to share it, that the story mattered to him more than he had let on. "But since you ask, and since we may not have as much later as either of us would like, I will give you the short version." We reached the bottom of the ladder and moved into the narrow access corridor leading toward the old cargo airlock, our footsteps echoing off the metal walls. "Long before my people built ships to cross the stars," Kaloth said, "we were hunters on our homeworld, and hunters alone, following the old ways of strength and claw. But there is a legend, passed down through the oldest bloodlines, of a species we encountered on a distant world during our earliest expansion. A species without claws, without natural armor, without any of the advantages that made a creature worth respecting in the eyes of my ancestors. Humans," I said. "We do not know for certain," Kaloth admitted. "The legend is old enough that details have been lost to time, distorted by generations of retelling. But the story says these small, clawless creatures faced my ancestors not with weapons, but with something else entirely. They faced danger with steady hands and calm minds, refusing to run even when running would have been the easier choice, refusing to freeze even when fear would have justified it. My ancestors, who had never respected anything that could not tear flesh with claw or fang, found themselves respecting something they had never expected to value. We reached the final bend in the corridor before the cargo airlock, and Kaloth paused, his hand raised for silence, listening to something I could not yet hear. "The legend says my ancestors named this quality by a scent," he continued quietly, "a particular chemical marker that certain rare individuals carry, something tied not to species but to a specific combination of courage and calm under pressure. My people call it the packmark scent, though it has grown rare enough over the centuries that most Dravaki alive today have never encountered it. I did not believe in it myself, not truly, until 3 days ago, in a maintenance corridor, when I caught it from a small, clawless creature repairing a coolant valve with steady hands despite clear and obvious fear. I stood there in the dim corridor, absorbing the weight of what he had just told me, understanding for the first time why he had looked at me the way he had that first day, why the word he had chosen in the mess hall carried so much more meaning than a simple gesture of protection. "You're saying I smell like courage," I said, because even in a moment this serious, some part of me needed to make it slightly less overwhelming. Kaloth's mouth did something that might have been the beginning of a smile, quickly suppressed. Crudely put, but not entirely wrong. Among my people, that scent marks kinship stronger than blood. When a Dravaki names another creature little brother, it is not a casual gesture. It is a declaration that we will defend that creature with the same ferocity we would defend our own younger kin, without hesitation, without condition. Before I could respond, a distant metallic groan echoed through the corridor ahead of us, the unmistakable sound of a docking clamp being forced apart by something far stronger than the mechanism was built to withstand. "They have breached the outer airlock," Kaloth said, his entire posture shifting instantly from storyteller to hunter, every trace of warmth replaced by cold readiness. "Move to the control panel now. I will hold this position." I sprinted the final stretch of corridor toward the manual override panel embedded in the wall beside the cargo airlock, my hands already running through the sequence I had memorized months ago during a routine maintenance drill I had never expected to need in a real emergency. Behind me, I heard the heavy clang of the inner airlock door beginning to give way, and Kaloth's low growl, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the very walls of the corridor, promising violence to whatever came through that door first. My fingers found the panel's manual release, and I began entering the override sequence, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat, every second stretching impossibly long as the airlock door groaned louder behind me, closer to giving way entirely, while I forced my shaking hands to move with the same steady precision Kaloth had claimed to recognize in me 3 days ago in an entirely different corridor, under entirely different circumstances, when neither of us had known just how much that recognition was about to matter. The panel flashed a warning, 3 digits short of the full sequence, and behind me the airlock door finally gave way with a shriek of tearing metal. I did not turn around. Turning around would have cost me the half-second I needed, and Kaloth had already placed himself between me and whatever was coming through, his low growl rising into something far more dangerous, a sound that seemed to shake loose dust from the corridor ceiling. 3 raiders came through the breach in quick succession, armored in dark plating that covered every inch of their bodies, faces hidden behind reflective visors that gave away nothing about the species underneath. They carried weapons built for one purpose, and the moment they saw Kaloth standing in their path, all 3 of them hesitated, just for an instant, the kind of hesitation that told me they had heard stories about the Dravaki long before this mission and had hoped never to test them. That hesitation was the only opening Kaloth needed. He moved faster than anything his size had any right to move, closing the distance before the lead raider could raise a weapon, and the corridor filled with the sounds of a fight I did not dare look away from, even as my hands kept working the override panel. I heard the clatter of a weapon knocked from a gauntleted hand, the heavy thud of a body meeting a wall, the sharp intake of breath from raiders who had clearly expected an easier fight than the one they were getting. "Blake," Kaloth's voice cut through the chaos, tight with effort, but still commanding. "The panel. Now." I forced my eyes back to the display and entered the final 3 digits with hands that had somehow steadied despite everything happening behind me. The panel chimed green, and the heavy emergency bulkhead began sliding shut behind the breach point, a wall of reinforced alloy designed to seal off exactly this kind of intrusion. "Get clear," I shouted, watching the gap narrow. "The bulkhead is closing." Kaloth disengaged from the raider he had pinned against the corridor wall and stepped back through the narrowing gap in one fluid motion, leaving the 3 raiders trapped on the far side as the bulkhead sealed shut with a final, heavy clang that echoed through the corridor like a closing verdict. For a moment, neither of us moved. I stood at the panel, chest heaving, while Kaloth stood a few feet away, a shallow gash across one forearm, the only visible mark of the encounter, already beginning to seal on its own, the way I had heard Dravaki wounds tended to do. "They will not get through that bulkhead," I said, my voice shaking slightly with the last of the adrenaline. "Not without cutting tools, and even then, it will take them time." "Time we can use," Kaloth said, already moving toward the comm panel mounted nearby. He pressed the channel open. "Commander Sharma, the cargo airlock breach is sealed. 3 raiders contained on the far side. The residential corridor is secure." Sharma's voice came through, tight with relief, but still carrying the strain of a station under siege. "Copy that, Kaloth. We have 2 more breach points on the upper docking ring. Defense teams are engaging, but we are stretched thin. If you 2 can move to reinforce the eastern corridor, we could use the help." "Understood," Kaloth said, already turning back toward me. "Can you keep moving?" I nodded, though every part of me wanted nothing more than a moment to simply breathe. "I know the fastest route through the maintenance shafts. It'll get us there faster than the main corridors." We moved together, back the way we had come, and then up through a narrow vertical shaft I had used a dozen times during routine repairs, never once imagining I would climb it during an actual attack on the station. Kaloth followed close behind me, his larger frame moving with surprising ease through the tight space, and I found myself grateful, in a strange way I did not have time to fully examine, that he trusted my knowledge of this station enough to follow my lead through its hidden passages. We emerged onto the eastern corridor, into a scene of controlled chaos. Station defense personnel had formed a rough line near a secondary breach point, trading fire with raiders who had managed to force open a smaller docking connection, and in the middle of it, Daniel was crouched behind an overturned equipment crate, working frantically at an exposed conduit panel. "Daniel," I called, sprinting toward him with Kaloth close behind. "About time," Daniel shouted back, not looking up from his work. "The bulkhead controls for this section are fused. I need another 30 seconds to reroute power, but the raiders keep pushing forward, and the defense line is barely holding." Kaloth did not wait for further explanation. He moved past me toward the defense line, positioning himself at the most exposed point in the corridor, and his presence alone seemed to steady the station's defenders, who fell into a tighter, more confident formation the moment he took his place among them. I dropped down beside Daniel, examining the conduit panel with the same practiced eye I had used on 100 coolant valves and power couplings over the past 6 months. "Show me what you've got." "The relay here is fried," Daniel said, pointing to a scorched section of wiring. "I can bridge it, but I need a stable power source, and everything on this section is running through the same damaged line." I scanned the corridor quickly, my mind running through the station schematics I had memorized, and spotted an auxiliary junction box 3 meters away, tucked into an alcove that the fighting had not yet reached. "There, that junction feeds the emergency lighting grid. It's not much, but it should be enough to power the bulkhead controls if we bridge it correctly." Daniel followed my gaze and grinned, despite the chaos around us. "You are full of surprises today, Owen Blake." We worked fast, running a temporary bridge cable between the junction box and the fused relay, while the sounds of the fight continued around us. Kaloth's voice, occasionally rising above the noise in sharp, commanding bursts that seemed to coordinate the defense line as much as any weapon he carried. I kept my hands steady on the wiring, focusing entirely on the task in front of me, refusing to let the danger around us slow my work, because I understood now, more clearly than I ever had before, that this was exactly the kind of moment Kaloth had recognized in me from the very beginning. "Got it," Daniel said, as the final connection clicked into place. "Bulkhead controls should be live now." I hit the release, and the emergency bulkhead began grinding shut across the breach point, cutting off the raiders' access before they could push further into the station. The defenders let out a ragged cheer, and I saw Kaloth step back from the closing gap, his expression carrying something that looked almost like satisfaction as he glanced toward Daniel and me. But the moment of relief was short-lived. Sharma's voice crackled urgently through every comm channel at once. All units, be advised, the raiders are attempting to breach the reactor control deck directly above the residential ring. If they gain access to the reactor systems, they can override our containment protocols and threaten the entire station. I need whoever is closest to that deck to move now. I felt my stomach drop, because I knew exactly which deck she meant, and I knew, with a sudden cold certainty, that the fastest route there ran directly through a maintenance shaft that only a handful of people on this entire station had ever used. "I know the way," I said, already turning toward the nearest access hatch. "But it's a narrow crawl space. Only one person can move through it quickly, and even then, it will be close." Kaloth's gaze met mine, and I saw the same recognition pass between us that had first sparked in that quiet corridor days ago, the understanding that some moments called for exactly the kind of steady, clever mind that his people had once respected above claws and strength. "Then you will guide me," he said, "and I will do what my claws are for. Together, little brother, or not at all." I nodded, my fear settling into something calmer, something closer to purpose, and together we moved toward the hatch, racing against a threat that could still cost the entire station everything if we did not reach the reactor deck in time. The crawl space ran narrow and dark, barely wide enough for my shoulders, let alone Kaloth's much larger frame, but he pressed forward without complaint, his breathing controlled, and even despite the tight fit. I led the way with a small handheld light, calling out turns and warnings over my shoulder, relying on memory built from months of routine inspections that I had never expected to matter this much. "Left here," I said, ducking under a low pipe junction. "Then straight for 20 meters. It opens onto a maintenance platform just above the reactor control room." "How much time do we have?" Kaloth asked, his voice steady despite the strain of moving through such a confined space. "I don't know," I admitted. "But if they're already at the control room, it won't be much." We pushed forward faster, and within minutes the crawl space opened onto a narrow platform overlooking the reactor control room below, a wide chamber filled with humming machinery and banks of monitoring consoles. 2 raiders stood at the primary console, one working quickly at the controls while the other kept watch near the room's main entrance, and I felt a fresh spike of fear seeing how close they already were to whatever override they intended to trigger. Kaloth studied the room below with the calm focus of a hunter assessing terrain before a strike. "The one at the console is the priority. Stop them before they finish, and the other becomes far less dangerous." "There's a service ladder on the far side," I whispered, pointing to a shadowed section of the platform. "It drops down near the console, but it's exposed the whole way." "Then I will draw their attention," Kaloth said, "and you will reach the console the moment their eyes are elsewhere." Before I could argue that this plan placed him in the most danger, he had already moved, dropping from the platform in a controlled fall that landed him directly between the 2 raiders and the door, cutting off their retreat before either of them had fully registered his presence. The raider near the entrance spun immediately, weapon raised, but Kaloth closed the distance before a shot could be fired, and the sound of the brief struggle that followed was sharp and decisive, ending far faster than I expected. The second raider abandoned the console and turned to face this new threat, but that hesitation, that half-second of distraction, was exactly what I needed. I scrambled down the service ladder, my hands slipping slightly on the rungs in my hurry, and dropped the final meter onto the control room floor, sprinting toward the console the moment my feet found solid ground. The display in front of me showed a partially completed override sequence, something designed to disable the reactor's containment safeguards, and my stomach turned cold at how close the raider had come to finishing it. I did not have time to fully understand every line of code scrolling across the screen, but I recognized the pattern from emergency drills, and my hands moved on instinct, reversing each step of the sequence as quickly as I could manage. Behind me, I heard the sounds of Kaloth finishing his confrontation with the second raider, and moments later, his heavy footsteps approached the console, his shadow falling over the display as he watched me work. "Can you stop it?" he asked, his voice carrying a tension I had not heard from him before, the first crack in his otherwise unshakable calm. "I think so," I said, forcing my hands to stay steady even as my heart pounded. "They were almost through, but the sequence isn't complete. If I can just—" The console flashed a warning, and for one terrifying second, I thought I had made a mistake that would cost us everything. Then the warning cleared, replaced by a steady green confirmation, and the reactor's containment indicators returned to their normal operating pattern. "Contained," I said, my voice barely more than a breath. "It's contained." I keyed the comm unit built into the console, my hands still shaking with the aftermath of everything that had just happened. "Commander Sharma, reactor deck is secure. Both raiders neutralized. Containment protocols are stable." Sharma's voice came back immediately, relief evident even through the strain in her tone. "Copy that, Blake. Excellent work. All units, the primary threats to station systems have been neutralized. Converge on the remaining raider positions and secure the docking ring." The fighting continued for another 20 minutes across the station, but with the reactor secured and the residential ring protected, the tide had clearly turned. The raiders, cut off from their objectives and facing a defense far more coordinated than they had anticipated, began a fighting retreat back toward their vessels, and within the hour, the 3 unmarked ships disengaged from the station entirely, retreating into the dark of space as quickly as they had arrived. By the time the all-clear sounded through the station's comm system, I found myself sitting on the floor of the reactor control room, back against the console I had just used to save the entire station, every muscle in my body finally allowing itself to feel the exhaustion I had been holding back for the better part of an hour. Kaloth lowered himself to sit beside me, a posture that looked strange for someone so large in a room built for far smaller controls, and for a long moment, neither of us spoke. "You did well, little brother," he said finally. "I was terrified the whole time," I admitted. "I know," he said. "I could smell it. And still your hands did not shake when it mattered most. That is the entire measure of what my people once valued above all else, before too many generations forgot the lesson." I let out a breath that was half laugh, half release of tension, too large to hold any longer. I still don't fully understand what happened back there, in the mess hall, why saying those words carries so much weight for your people. Kaloth was quiet for a moment, considering how to answer. "Among the Dravaki, kinship is not given lightly. When I called you little brother in front of the crew, I was not offering you a compliment. I was making every Dravaki who ever hears of this moment understand that harming you would be the same as harming my own blood. It is a declaration few of my people make even once in a lifetime, and none make without absolute certainty." "And you were certain," I said, "after 3 days." "I was certain the moment I caught your scent in that corridor," he said. "Everything since has only confirmed it. You do not run, you do not freeze, you solve the problem in front of you, however afraid you are while doing it. My people have hunted across 100 worlds, and that quality remains rarer than any weapon or any claw." We sat there a while longer, letting the quiet settle after the chaos, until the sound of footsteps approaching drew our attention to the doorway, where Commander Sharma stood alongside Daniel, both of them looking at us with expressions that had shifted noticeably from where they had started that morning. "The station owes you both a great deal," Sharma said, addressing us together in a way that made it clear she no longer saw a maintenance technician and an alien guest sitting side by side, but 2 crew members who had just saved everyone aboard. "I will be filing a full report on today's events, and I intend to make certain your actions are recognized properly." "I only did what needed doing," I said, still slightly stunned by everything that had happened. "That is precisely the point," Sharma said. "Half the crew on this station spent 6 months treating you as though you had nothing to offer beyond fixing coolant valves. Today, you helped save every single one of them, including the ones who mocked you the loudest." Word of the day's events spread through the station even faster than the earlier gossip about a shared breakfast. By evening, when the mess hall filled again for the first proper meal since the attack, the atmosphere had changed in a way I could feel the moment I walked through the door. Conversations quieted, not out of the same wary mockery I had grown used to, but out of something closer to genuine respect, the kind that had to be earned rather than assumed. Grellick approached me near the food counter, and for the first time since I had come aboard this station, his usual mocking edge had vanished entirely from his voice. "I owe you an apology," he said, the words clearly uncomfortable for him to form. "I judged you by your size and your lack of claws, and I was wrong to do so. My cousin lives in the residential ring you helped protect today. I will not forget what you did." "You don't owe me anything," I said, though the gesture meant more to me than I let on. "We were all just trying to survive the day." "Some of us did more than survive," he said. "Some of us made certain the rest of us could." Neera joined us shortly after, along with several other crew members I had worked alongside for months without ever earning more than passing acknowledgement, and for the first time I found myself at the center of a conversation that treated my contributions as equal to anyone else's, rather than diminished by my smaller frame and softer skin. Kaloth found me later that evening, standing near the same observation window where I had first watched the raiders approach hours earlier, the black expanse of space now calm and undisturbed once more. "You have earned something today that few small creatures ever manage," he said, settling beside me at the viewport. "Not just my recognition, but the recognition of an entire station that once dismissed you without a second thought." "I couldn't have done any of it without you," I said. "The bulkhead, the reactor, none of it would have mattered if you hadn't held that corridor." "Perhaps," Kaloth said. "But strength alone would not have solved the override sequence, and claws alone would not have known which corridors led where. My people spent generations believing that strength was the only currency worth valuing, and today you reminded me why that belief was always incomplete." I thought about everything that had happened since that first strange encounter in the maintenance corridor, the mockery that had defined my first 6 months aboard this station, and the sudden, dramatic shift that had followed a single meal, a single word, spoken in a crowded hall, and a crisis that had tested exactly the qualities Kaloth claimed to recognize in me from the very beginning. "What happens now?" I asked. "Word of what happened here will spread, won't it? Beyond this station." "It already has," Kaloth said. "My people communicate across vast distances faster than you might expect, and a Dravaki naming a human as kin, in the middle of an active crisis no less, is not the kind of story that stays contained to one station for long. Other worlds will hear of it. Other species will begin to wonder what they have misjudged about your kind, the same way I once misjudged nothing at all, because I trusted the old stories when others had long since forgotten them." I looked out at the stars, thinking about the 4 other humans scattered across this station, and the countless others spread thin across a galaxy full of species who had spent generations underestimating what a small, clawless creature might be capable of when courage met calm under enough pressure. "They mocked me for 6 months, I said quietly, "because I was small, because I didn't have claws or armor or any of the things they valued. And today," Kaloth said, "you proved that none of those things were ever the true measure of worth. Size fades, claws break, strength runs out, but a mind that stays steady when everything around it demands panic, that is a rarer thing than my people ever properly understood, and it will not be forgotten easily now that I have spoken it aloud before witnesses." We stood together at that viewport for a long while, watching the stars turn slowly beyond the station's hull, and I found myself thinking not about the fear I had felt during the crisis, nor the years of quiet mockery that had come before it, but about what might lie ahead now that an apex predator, feared across 100 worlds, had looked past every obvious measure of strength and found something worth calling kin. Somewhere across the vast distances between stars, word was already spreading of what had happened aboard this station, carried along the same channels that had once carried only warnings about the Dravaki and their fearsome reputation. Now those channels carried something new, a story about a small, clawless creature who had stood steady in the face of danger and earned the respect of the galaxy's most feared hunters, one quiet act of courage at a time. I did not know yet how far that story would travel, or how many more doors it would open for humanity among the stars. But standing there beside Kaloth, watching the calm return to a station that had nearly fallen to raiders hours earlier, I understood that whatever came next, I would not be facing it as the small, mocked outsider I had been that morning. I would be facing it as someone's little brother, and that, I was beginning to realize, changed absolutely everything.